Hello and welcome everyone! Today we're talking about musical textures, which is one of the two main organizing elements of contemporary art music, besides musical gestures. This video is part of a longer video series combining contemporary art music with practical examples. Let's check out some sonic results before diving into the theory. Today's talk is heavily based on Dennis Smalley's paper on spectromorphology from 1997. In this paper, Smalley set out to create a framework of vocabulary to describe musical features based on their spectromorphology, or in simpler terms, the timbral behavior in time. A key aspect of that paper, and of art music in general, is the idea that sound, gestures, and textures together form the two main structure and principles of contemporary art music. I've already published a video on gestures, and you can find that here, but in short, gestures are all sounds that could be imagined to be made by humans, as those sounds reflect the human activity that was needed to create it. For example, think about the sound and decay of drums or piano hits. Textures, on the other hand, are, according to Smalley, so stretched out in time that they lose their human physicality as they go beyond the timescale of typical human-made sounds. We can think of it as long pads or drones, or other sustained sounds that often have internal variations over time. This effect can be achieved using, for example, synthesis, or in instrumental composition. It should be noted that this is a somewhat different definition for the term texture than its origin in tonal music. In tonal music, a texture is defined as the sum of musical layers and their relationship to one another, for example being represented as monophonic or polyphonic textures. We, however, for the sake of this video, will stick with the definition of textures as sounds that linger beyond the typical duration of musical gestures. Thinking about gestures and textures is actually a great way of composing music, as gestures and gestural-focused music, according to Smalley, is governed by a sense of forward motion, linearity, and of narrativity, whereas textures, according to Adrian Moore, play a key role in defining the world in which we are listening. Additionally, Smalley introduced a language for texture motion, as you can see here. There's no need to know these by heart, but if you're stuck designing your next synth pad, you could, as a creative exercise, figure out what texture motion your pad exhibits right now, and try adapting it to other ones. So why should we care about textures and gestures as structuring principles? For one, textures can be used as a backdrop to gestural elements. A masterful use of this technique can be found in most of Parmigiani's work. Another use for textures is as a binding element. Analyzing a Japanese improvised noise performance, Hivarinen found that gestures that were often repeated implied a sense of intention, whereas textures were left meandering, introducing a sense of indeterminacy. Structure is therefore created via gestures, and textures are used as breathing room in between structural elements. We can also consider how gestures and textures interact with one another. Smalley introduced a selection of descriptors here as well, that help us to describe the interplay of textures and gestures in time. For example, textures can dominate, be subordinated, conflict or coexist with other textures and gestures, and this relationship might change over time, creating structure. So in a very basic sense, textures can be the main focal point supported by gestures. They can be equally important as gestures, often acting as binding element, or they can be a backdrop where gestures play the main role. And all three roles of a texture can have various levels of interplay, from indifference to complete entanglement. Very often, the main role of texture in a music piece will change over time as well. And that's a lot of use cases for us as music composers. So what makes a good texture? Well, the answer to this question will heavily rely on the function of the texture in the first place. For example, if a texture is the main focus of attention, it should be much more intricate than a texture that is in the background. There are many more functions a texture can hold, which is easiest to show using practical examples. So for me, a great texture has a lot of movement and internal changes that keep it interesting to the listener. There's basically two ways of adding some sort of movement to a texture. One is adding CV control to the sound synthesis stage, and one is of course to change parameters in the downstream components, such as filters, VCAs, or effects. In this case here, I'm using a Piston Honda, which is a wavetable oscillator, and you can hear that without any CV control, it's a very static texture. The next thing I can do is I can change which wavetable to address by adding some slow-moving control to the wavetables. But the biggest changes will come when I add a second oscillator that is slightly detuned. And I will vary the amount of detune as well using CV input. Now, I already like this texture a lot, but for me, what I normally do with harmony-rich textures is that I run them through a filter, so I have a bit more fine control of how much frequencies and what frequency content I will release over time. So in this case here, I use the bandpass of the Katowice, and I'm controlling the bandpass width and the bandpass position using a joystick to give me a bit more control of how the frequencies of that texture behave. And I actually use this technique in my dance music as well. So let's check out a practical example next. So here I just wanted to walk you through how it works from a texture to a final track. I started off with this texture that I made via a kind of additive synthesis and some delays. As a next step, I added an EQ to filter out all the low frequencies and emphasize the high frequencies. After that, I added and animated a bandpass filter to create specific movements that fit with my track. And here you can hear the texture in the context of the full track. Next up, let's have a listen to this texture here. This texture is actually made by layering two different textures above one another. I've created the first layer using my sampler, the assimilator, and here I've triggered different piano loops at different times with different offsets and different amounts of bitrate reduction to get this kind of textural feeling here. The second layer was actually made using a Basimilus Territus alter that is normally used for percussion, but if you trigger it at audio rates, you get interesting textural effects as well. All I had to do was filter out all the low end, and I was left with this kind of additional texture here. Both textures move and interact in different ways and on different time frames, which is why layering them makes them so interesting together. Alright, that's all I have for you today. Feel free to share your own tricks and techniques to create interesting textures in the comments below. Consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. I'll leave you with a few more textures, and I'll see you all in the next video.